We are just going to get started here very, very shortly. Thank you all for tuning in, for being punctual and all that good stuff. My name is Kwame Nkrumah. I'm serving as the SoCal Black Community Programs Director for the African Black Coalition. This is PE with ABC. Welcome. If this is your first time, welcome. And if it's your second time, also welcome. Today's lesson is on the origins of Pan-Africanism. And this is a very crucial topic. And I want to emphasize the fact that we're covering the origins of it. And why I want to emphasize the origins is because Pan-Africanism as an ideology is so vast and is so complex that by no means will today's lesson be an exhaustive lesson into the ideology. If anything, it's a fundamental analysis, and it's really just the basics of it. So, from this lesson, there's definitely going to be further research for us all to do and to dive into. And this evening's lesson is just supposed to serve as that, that launch pad, if you will, that starting point. So again, thank you all for tuning in. Let's go ahead and get it started. Let me pull this up. Boom. Okay. So again, everyone, welcome to PE with ABC. This is course number 2, the Origins of Pan-Africanism. My name is Kwame Nkrumah. I'm the SoCal Black Community Programs Director for the African Black Coalition. And let's go ahead and get right on to it. So starting it off with a quote by one of the pioneers of Pan-Africanism, Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah was the first prime minister and president of Ghana. And Ghana was the first African nation, West African nation, to fight for their independence. March 6, 1957, Ghana gained its independence. And what Kwame says, he says, all people of African descent, whether they live in North or South America, the Caribbean, or in any part of the world, are Africans and belong to the African nation. And this was a large part of Kwame Nkrumah's, beliefs and his theoretical understandings of Pan-Africanism, that there is no certain place that Pan-Africanism and the African nation are housed, right? There isn't just the continent Africa and the Caribbean, or there isn't just Africa, the continent by itself. Kwame Nkrumah refers to the entire globe, wherever Africans find themselves, right? North Pole to South Pole, they belong to the African nation. And that's what informs a lot of the key principles of Pan-Africanism as an ideology. So real quickly, and throughout tonight's discussion, throughout tonight's workshop, we're going to be utilizing the chat box for, at various points in time. And that's just so I can make it as interactive as possible. So the first thing that I want to pose to us all is, when we hear this phrase, African unity, what comes to our mind? And you can, again, share it in the chat box. And there's no wrong answer. The only wrong answer really is no answer at all. So again, when we think of African unity, what does it mean? Have we heard it before? If so, where? What do we think it is supposed to represent? Anything. So take a few moments and input it in the chat box. African unity, what we think that means, and how we should understand that as a concept. So again, take a few moments, do some reflecting on this phrase, African unity. What do we think it means? If we've heard it before, where did we hear it, and who said it, or in what way did we hear it? When we think about what it means to be united, or what unity means, how does it change when we put African in front? So again, the phrase is African unity, and answer in the chat box. What does this mean? What do we think about it? Okay, the African diaspora coming together as a collective unit. Okay, that's good. Excellent. And what I'll also do is as we all share our input in the chat box, if there's any like key terms or anything that I think we should focus on, I'm gonna write them on this fancy board behind me. So again, the phrase, what is African unity? Or the phrase is African unity. And what I want us all to do is to reflect and think to ourselves, what does this mean, right? So African unity, collective unit. I like that word, collective. What else? What else? A community that has unconditional love for one another, okay? Love. What else? A collective experience in history that transcends geographic boundaries. Okay, I like that. All right, geography right here. And that goes right back to Kwame Nkrumah's quote when he says that wherever Africans find themselves, they belong to the African nation. Okay, no matter your geographic location, you should be invested and interested in the lives of other Black African people. Woo! All right, Brother Khalil, okay. If you live in Oakland, you should be aware of the condition of our people in the Congo, and the same for the rest of the diaspora. This is very critical, and we'll take a brief sidebar on this note. So there's this Haitian scholar, historian, Dr. Baina Bello, and there's a lecture that she gives. I'll write her name down. There's this lecture that she gives. You can find it on YouTube if you look up her name. Baina Bello. And in this lecture that she gives on YouTube, she is describing what Brother Khalil says here in terms of if you live in one place, you should be concerned and interested and invested in Black people in another place. What she talks about in her lecture is she says, when we think about groups of African people in different places around the world, we can't think of these different groups as these divorced or as these separated or as these isolated groups. So it's not Black people in Chicago, Black people in Congo, Black people in Brazil way over here, right? We have to understand that all of our lives and all of our interests and all of our issues are intertwined. What Dr. Baina Bello says is for us to operate with the thinking of, well, Black people over here are cool, it's only Black people over there that are going through it. She says that that's not only a flawed way of thinking, but it's a dangerous way of thinking. Because if that group is resting on their laurels saying we're fine here, and over there they're struggling, Dr. Baina Bello, in her lecture, she says, if Black people are dying and struggling and starving over here, systematically, institutionally, intentionally, right, what do you think they'll bring when they come over here? Don't think that the oppression and exploitation of African people knows limits. I think it was Mark Lamont Hill said, white supremacy doesn't have a passport. They don't limit themselves in terms of where they go or what they do. So that's very, very important for us to know. Thank you, brother, for that point. What else? What else? Sense of community with love. Sense of community with and love of our people throughout the diaspora. Embracing our culture, similarities, differences, etc. Okay? Accepting every part of being African, no matter where you are. Recognizing your variability. Okay? Help one another in building up the African diaspora. Very good, very good. All right. Here we go. From Kwame Nkrumah's book, Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare, right here, came out in 1968 when he published it. He outlines what African unity implies. He says, African unity therefore implies imperialism and foreign oppression should be eradicated in all their forms. He says that neocolonialism should be recognized and eliminated. The new African nation must develop within a continental framework, and that African unity gives an indispensable continental dimension to the concept of the African nation. So when we think about the different concepts and notions around African unity, we have to understand that it's more than just a question of how do we feel about each other, right? It's more than just seeing each other as family. It's actually a very political and a very economical and social and systematic way of viewing our people. So Kwame Nkrumah articulates this idea of imperialism being eradicated. imperialism, right, eradicated. And then he also goes on to talk about a continental dimension being applied when we think about our African nation. Again, for us to operate with the mindset of we are different groups of Black people in different parts of the world, to operate with that mindset is to operate with a flawed mindset, and not to operate with a tangible African unity worldview for us to effectively organize our African nation. And again, this comes from Kwame Nkrumah's Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare. It's a must read for all African people, truthfully. And it truly is a handbook. It's only 122 pages, and it's small. So, and it's a very thorough piece of scholarship. And we'll, get into that later. Again, Kwame Nkrumah, we all want a united Africa, united not only in our concept of what unity connotes, but united in our common desire to move forward together in dealing with all the problems that can best be solved only on a continental basis. So again, there's that continental dimension. And what Kwame Nkrumah articulates is that that's how we have to go about solving our problems. And that to try to solve our problems with any other dimension or with any other frame of mind is to not solve those problems. It isn't enough for struggling Black folks in Oakland to think, okay, how do we solve our problems here? And then someone comes along and says, well, how are you gonna solve problems in Ghana? Oh, well, that doesn't pertain to us. That's a flawed mindset. We have to be thinking global. We have to be operating with this basis that, okay, if we want a united Africa, we have to actually be tapped in with our people, wherever they are, around the world. So the basic principles of Pan-Africanism, right? And this presentation is available to you all as participants if you can go to the PE with ABC syllabus. So don't worry, you don't have to, frantically write all this down. So the basic principles: the total liberation and unification of Africa under scientific socialism. That definition comes from a lecture given by Kwame Nkrumah. And there's this concept of none of us is free until all of us are free. Again, there's that idea of the continental dimension, right? That the independence of one African nation is meaningless if the whole of Africa is not independent. Kwame Nkrumah articulates that. Haile Selassie from Ethiopia articulates that. Various other African leaders have brought this concept right to fruition. Pan-African movement has a mass character. This is crucial. Pan-African movement is mass movement. And what that means is movement cannot happen from the top down, meaning the leaders are the top and the masses are the base, the bottom. Pan-African movement does not happen from top to bottom. Pan-African movement happens from bottom up. It involves the masses of African people and not just the select few. So not just the leadership, not just the educated, right? Not just the skilled, everybody, the masses of African people. That's the kind of movement that is Pan-African movement, right? And it's a mass movement. And the enemies of Pan-Africanism, what Pan-Africanism fights against to eradicate in all forms: imperialism, capitalism, and colonialism. So now there's this very, very crucial document written by George Padmore, who was another pioneer of Pan-Africanism. Very crucial document. It's called the History of the PanAfrican Congress. And it's a declaration to the colonial workers, farmers, and intellectuals. And before I read from the document, I just want to write down the different titles that he is addressed, or the different groups of people he's addressing in this document, because I think it's important. Colonial workers, farmers, and intellectuals. And the reason why the the reason why George Padmore addresses these groups specifically is important, and we'll get to it. So I'll read the document right here. The delegates of the Fifth Pan-African Congress believe in the right of all peoples to govern themselves. We affirm the right of all colonial peoples to control their own destiny. All colonies must be free from foreign imperialist control, whether political or economic. The peoples of the colonies must have the right to elect their own governments without restrictions from foreign powers. We say to the peoples of the colonies that they must fight for these ends by all the means at their disposal. The object of imperialist powers is to exploit. By granting the right to colonial peoples to govern themselves, that object is defeated. Therefore, the struggle for political power by colonial and subject peoples is the first step towards and the necessary prerequisite to complete social, economic, and political emancipation. In this first excerpt of the document, George Padmore is articulating the significance of political power. Political power. And to be clear, what Pan-Africanists articulate as political power is not electoral politics. What that means is George Padmore isn't articulating the struggle for political power as let's all go out and vote, or let's all go out and campaign for a certain presidential candidates. That's not the objective of political power as it's articulated by Pan-Africanists. And that's very important for us to understand. And in this first excerpt, George Padmore is articulating this process that needs to happen for complete social, economic, and political emancipation to occur, to take place. What he says is that the struggle for political power is the first step, right, towards that total emancipation. And it's a necessary prerequisite, meaning if political power is not achieved, is not earned, you haven't opened the doors to social or economic emancipation. And that's crucial. He goes on, the Fifth Pan-African Congress therefore calls on the workers and farmers of the colonies to organize effectively. Colonial workers must be in the front of the battle against imperialism. Your weapons, the strike, and the boycott are invincible. We also call upon the intellectuals and professional classes of the colonies to awaken to their responsibilities by fighting for trade union rights, the right to form cooperatives, freedom of the press, assembly, demonstration and strike, freedom to print and read the literature, which is necessary for the education of the masses. You will be using the only means by which your liberties will be won and maintained. Today, there is only one road to effective action, the organization of the masses. And in that organization, the educated colonials must join. And he says, colonial and subject peoples of the world unite. So prior to us reading this document, again, the reason why I highlighted colonial workers, intellectuals, and farmers as these distinct groups that George Padmore addresses is because he gives each group a specific task. So there's no one left out, nor is there one group dedicated to do all the work. That's that mass character behind Pan-African movement, right? He says colonial workers are in front. They're the front line. They're the soldiers, they're the warriors. They have various weapons that are invincible, right? The strike and the boycott. It's very important that we understand the only way we achieve our objectives and obtain our power is if everybody participates. And that doesn't mean everyone participates and one controls the participation of the other groups. No. Colonial workers have a job to do, farmers have a job to do, intellectuals, the educated have a job to do. And he calls upon the intellectuals and the so-called professional class to awaken to our responsibilities. We shouldn't assume that our educational or technical achievements or accomplishments affords us this pass or this token of, okay, you're good to enter society. No, the very fabric of society is what's wrong, is what causes our people to be exploited and racially an underclass, right? So again, understanding the different roles that different groups play, colonial workers, farmers, and intellectuals. Everyone has to be involved in order for mass movement to take place. So the fifth Pan-African Congress. This is important. London, October 1945. So how many years ago was that? 75 years ago, right? I'm not a math major. The reason why understanding the amount of years ago that this took place was for us to understand this history is not ancient. I think oftentimes sometimes we run the dangerous assumption of framing our history or African history as things that happened so long ago, way in the past. Slavery was way back then. The Fifth Pan-African Congress took place less than a century ago. And from this Congress, we'll be able to see in a bit, had massive implications for African people. So George Padmore and Kwame Nkrumah arranged for this Congress to be held in Manchester. At this Congress, 90 delegates attended, roughly a third from Africa, a third from the West Indies, and a third from British institutions and organizations. We can see a similarity, and actually a direct correlation, I should say, between this Fifth Pan-African Congress and mass movement as articulated by George Padmore. So George Padmore talks about colonial workers, farmers, and intellectuals. And then we can go back to Kwame Nkrumah talking about all people of African descent, wherever they find themselves, belong to the African nation. At the Fifth Pan-African Congress, it wasn't like all 90 delegates came from the continent, or all 90 delegates came from Europe, or all 90, etc. There was a very, There was a very equitable representation of African people. Some Africans from here, some from here, some from here. And that's a clear demonstration of mass movement and of what the African nation is representative of, right? And this is a little known fact. W.E.B. Du Bois served as the Congress chair, and W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the pioneers of Pan-Africanism, and he was actually one of the key organizers in the earlier Congresses. And it was his idea to change the idea of Pan-African. It was originally Pan-African Conference, and it was an annual conference. It was Du Bois' idea to change it to a Congress because he understood that a Congress has more elasticity and longevity, and in terms of fighting for their objectives. So again, expanding on the Fifth Pan-African Congress, politically, the Congress opposed the political oppression of Africa's peoples and the denial of a say in their country's futures. Economically, the Congress demanded an end to the exploitation of Africa's natural resources, which made European powers rich at the expense of Africa. The Congress discussed plans for nationalist movements across the continent of Africa, demanded independence from colonial rule and ends to racial discrimination, and set the groundwork for African unity. It was all but completely ignored by the international press. So, and before we go to this last point, when we think about history and not only what history is, what the contents of history are, but how the contents of history get, placed, how they get arranged. There's this African proverb that says, until the lion has a storyteller, the hunt will always glorify the hunted. And what that means is, if we are to rely on the information we're being given or being fed or being told from only one source, that means there are no other sources giving that input to that information to justify whether it's true or false, whether it's accurate or inaccurate. So the fact that the Fifth Pan-African Congress was all but completely ignored is not accidental. People didn't forget about it. They didn't go, oh, the Fifth Pan-African Congress was last week, we missed it. There was a clear intention set by the press and by the media to obscure this event from being told and from being, recorded in history. From 1945 to 1960, in 15 years, over 2/3 of the entire African continent earned its independence. And why this is important is, again, when we think about not only the utility, but the cruciality of organizing and of mass organizing, we can understand and appreciate how the Pan-African Congress was instrumental in the African continent, across the African continent, independence being gained, right? And colonization being fought head on. 15 years. In 15 years. So right after the 5th Pan-African Congress ended, you had nations and leaders and political parties and rebel groups going to work. There was no time in between. There wasn't like 5th Pan-African Congress, okay, that was cool, let's talk about it for a little bit. It was no. 5th Pan-African Congress, action. Let's go. Let's get to work. And here is a picture from some of the delegates at the 5th Pan-African Congress. In fact, on the right here, that sharp brother right there, that's Kwame Nkrumah, the first president and prime minister of Ghana. I'm still doing the research in terms of figuring out who the other delegates in this picture are, but he's who I've pointed out so far. And then here are 2 pictures from the Congress. This is like an actual, photo taking place. And then on the right is the Congress program. So October 13th to the 21st, 1945 is when the 5th Pan-African Congress took place. So now we're gonna get into some of the pioneers of Pan-Africanism. And again, this workshop is just the origins of Pan-Africanism. So again, this is not a everything you need to know workshop. Man, I don't really think we can reduce our history and our people to a everything you need to know style of learning. There's always going to be deeper research to do. So with every one of these names, please write them down, please make a note of them, and please do your research, on your own, and you'll be able to see the vast reservoirs of information on our people. So one of the early pioneers, Henry Sylvester Williams, he was a Trinidadian lawyer and writer, and he organized the first Pan-African Conference. It took place July 23rd to the 25th in 1900 in London also. From 1903 to 1905, he practiced law in Cape Town, South Africa, and he actually promoted African interests against white minority rule. George Padmore, a Trinidadian journalist, he founded the International African Opinion, a journal. He was an advisor to Kwame Nkrumah. In 1931, he wrote The Life and Struggles of Negro Toilers, which championed the cause of Black labor throughout the world. It's on my reading list. And he also established the International African Service Bureau. So these are soldiers, these are warriors. And we talked about this, if you were able to catch our lesson last week on Revolutionary Warriors of Africa. All of our mightiest warriors were not only fierce fighters, but they were formidable scholars and thorough thinkers. Someone like George Padmore understood firsthand the need to do both, to theorize and to practice, to merge the two, and to really engage in this struggle for freedom on all ends, from all angles and sides. Kwame Nkrumah, he led Ghana to independence in 1957. Again, Ghana gained independence. The exact date was March 6th, 1957. He was the first prime minister and president of Ghana. He was inspired by anti-colonial study and ideology, and he studied at Lincoln College in Pennsylvania. A lot of people actually, this is actually a little known fact about Kwame Nkrumah. Not only did he study in North America, but he actually spent around a decade here, and he organized with some of our people here. And in Ghana, he founded the Convention People's Party in 1949. And here we have that necessary prerequisite political power as the necessary prerequisite to total emancipation. Kwame Nkrumah understood this. And there's actually a quote of his. He says, seek, what is it? I don't want to misquote him, but essentially he says, seek first the political kingdom. And again, that's demonstrative of the need to organize for political power before organizing for any other means, right? Him and Nkrumah and the Convention People's Party sought self-government through the nonviolent strategy of positive action. Much like Martin Luther King's, nonviolent strategies, positive action employed the tactics of protest and strike against colonial administration. Kwame Nkrumah was directly influenced by the organizing and mobilizing efforts of Martin Luther King Jr. in North America. Again, it's important for us to understand that Pan-Africanism is a global ideology, and it's a mass movement-oriented ideology. In 1969, or it was published in 1969, he wrote the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare. And he actually drew significant inspiration from his observations of the People's War articulated by China's premier, Mao Zedong. Again, continental dimension, global orientation. Kwame Nkrumah did not just sit in Ghana and say, okay, how do we solve our problems? And we don't need help from the outside. W.E.B. Du Bois, he attended the first Pan-African Congress held in London in 1900. At that Congress, he was elected to be vice president, and it was during that Congress that he wrote, or that conference, that he wrote the Address to the Nations of the World. In 1905, he was the founder and general secretary of the Niagara Movement, an African-American protest group of scholars and professionals. He went on to organize a series of Pan-African Congresses in 1919, 1921, 1923, and 1927. And at each of these Congresses, the delegation were comprised of intellectuals from all over the globe, continent, West Indies, United States of America, and he actually became a naturalized citizen of Ghana in 1963, and he made his transition in Ghana. Jomo Kenyatta, some facts about him. In his early organizing, he wrote a letter to British authorities outlining central points of Kikuyu interests. Kikuyu is an ethnic group in Kenya. The security of land tenure and the demand for land taken by European settlers to be returned, improved educational opportunities for Black Africans, the repeal of hut and poll taxes, representation for Black Africans in the Legislative Council, freedom to pursue traditional customs, and in December 1963, he was elected as Prime Minister of Kenya under the Kenya African National Union, and 1 year later became Kenya's first president. So in Jomo Kenyatta's early organizing, he wrote letters to British authorities outlining the points of the interests of the people of Kenya. And in his letter, and later on he maintained his position when it came to the interests of the people. There was a very clear demand made for land and for political representation. And this is crucial, again, when we think about the core principles of Pan-Africanism and how political power is the necessary prerequisite to total emancipation. Jomo Kenyatta articulated the idea and the demand for land. And as we know, land is the basis of all independence, as said by Malcolm X. Kwame Ture, born Stokely Carmichael, our brother was the first to vocalize the phrase Black Power during a speech in 1966 in Selma, Alabama. And the reason why we should emphasize the idea of Black Power being vocalized is because, and Kwame Ture has expressed this himself, he said that just because Black Power was first uttered in 1966 does not mean Black Power did not exist prior to 1966. And that's important for us to know. Even in a lecture Kwame Ture gives on Pan-Africanism, he also articulates that Pan-Africanism as a word did not spark the birth of Pan-Africanism, the way of thought and the ideology. And that's important for us to know when we think about how we study ideologies and worldviews and things like that. Oftentimes the names that are given to these things does not indicate that being the start point, right? As being the basis at which it existed. There's always a back history, a deeper history behind it. In May 1965, he served as the chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And this is important because largely due to Kwame Ture's organizing efforts, and he articulates this, it was upon his being elected chairman of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that radicalized the organization. prior to his election to chairman, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was very heavy on integration and civil rights and things like that, nonviolent organizing. And Kwame Nkrumah stepped in and said, no, we need to change the methods and tactics we employ in our efforts. And then he went on to be one of the founders of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, and subsequently served as a political secretary to Kwame Nkrumah. And he also served alongside Ahmed Sékou Touré in striving for the independence of Guinea. And it's actually where Kwame Touré got his name from. So he was born Stanley Carmichael. After serving and working with Kwame Nkrumah and Sékou Touré, he changed his name to Kwame Touré to honor those two Africans specifically. I had to throw this one in there. Another notable pioneer of Pan-Africanism, Ross McConaughey. He was a Guyanese intellectual and political advisor, and he studied agriculture at Cornell University. While living in England, he joined the International African Service Bureau. And as we can remember, the International African Service Bureau was founded by George Padmore. While living in England, he opened up a number of restaurants and a nightclub, a bookshop. And during his entrepreneurial endeavors, he was always specifically catering the African Black population that lived in England. And he rented homes exclusively to Black people. And I'm doing further research on Ross McConaughey, but I believe our brother was one of the early Pan-Africanists who practiced this idea of class suicide. And this is a slight sidebar, a brief sidebar. Class suicide is this idea articulated by Amilcar Cabral. And Amilcar Cabral, another Pan-Africanist who organized for the independence of Guinea and Cape Verde. And what class suicide articulates, and this is similar to George Padmore and his articulation of the role of the colonial workers, farmers, and intellectuals. Class suicide is this idea that those among the economically privileged and the educated and the intelligent must perform this class suicide in order to organize the masses of their people. And think of it as a basic example would be if I was let's say I had a PhD and I owned my own home and I lived in, an affluent area, and I also owned other properties where I have tenants and I rent the properties out to folks. Class suicide, what that act describes is if I'm performing class suicide, I rent out those homes for a price that does not yield any profits for me, but I'm doing it to house my people, to house Black people, to house African people. That's just a basic example of class suicide. I encourage you all to do research on that idea because it's very, very critical. And again, I was doing that, going on that sidebar to basically articulate that Ross McConaughey was one of the early practitioners of class suicide. He also moved to, after living in England, he moved to Ghana and aligned himself with Kwame Nkrumah's Pan-Africanist wing of the Convention People's Party, and he also served as an advisor to Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya. What makes Ross McConaughey very unique is that he was a traveler, a globetrotter, and he would go to different African nations and be instrumental in their organizing for independence efforts. And then when independence or decolonization was achieved, he would move on, right? Ooh, okay. I've been doing a lot of talking, so I'm gonna open up the chat box again. And similar to the first thing we had responded to in the chat box, I want us all to think about this quote and really think what we should gain from it. What is it trying to teach us? And the quote is, Pan-Africanism is an inner need to know ourselves. We need to keep looking at each other until we annihilate our own suspicious moves and recognize the same enemy looking back at all of us over all the seas and all the centuries. And this comes from Carolyn Clark Fowler Gerard, who was an African poet. So again, take a few moments, read this quote to yourself, think really critically in terms of what it could mean and how we should, what we should learn from it, and then respond in the chat box what this quote is trying to teach us. Pan-Africanism is an inner need to know ourselves. When I first read this quote, it definitely took me a couple of reads to grasp it, and then even a few more reads to be able to articulate what I was retaining. So take your time. Again, read through it, read it again, and then respond in the chat box what we believe Carolyn Clark Fowler Gerard is teaching us. Matter of fact, I'll put that in the chat box too. What is this quote? Ooh, Sister Didi going on. Hold on, let me read it. Our liberation is coded into our DNA and is realized through our collective duty, action, reaction, and culture. To colonialism, imperialism, etc., we have been taught hegemonic ways that we must cast away in order to move forward as people. Hey, you better teach hard, Didi. What else? Again, reading this quote. I can't even follow up on that. Again, reading this quote, what do we think it's trying to teach us? And again, there is no wrong answer. This is really the time for us to study our ancestors and their teachings and their words and be able to pull from it what we need to move forward. So again, read the quote, read it again if you need to, read another time if you need to, and respond. What is it trying to teach us? Okay, Sister Nia. I think this quote is trying to convey the idea that our biggest struggle in the movement is the struggle of getting our own community on the same page. There are a few of us who tend to be more aware of things because of our experiences, but the majority of our people lack knowledge. Once we can get all of our people to follow the same agenda and can work together, we'll be able to liberate ourselves. You better teach our sister. Hold on. I'll write that down too. On the same page. And Kwame Nkrumah, just to highlight Sister Nia's response, thank you for that. Kwame Nkrumah articulates the need for our people to develop and sustain a unity of thought along with a unity of action. And he says that action the unity of action for African people is instinctive, right? We see one of our people getting assaulted by the enemy, we act, right? It's instinctive. The need for justice and the need for moral good is instinctive. We don't have to think about that. But the thought piece, theory, and how do we think about the modes we need to employ to gain our liberation, Kwame Nkrumah says that's where we need work. So he says that what we have is unity in action. And again, that's instinctive. So that's not, we don't necessarily have to concentrate very many resources to that because that's already something that we're, programmed to do. And what we need And what we need is unity in thought. So Sister Nia, absolutely. When we think about how as a people we get on the same page is to understand the need for that unity in thought. Now, that doesn't mean we think the same ways in terms of limiting our mental, how do I say this? Unity in thought doesn't mean we all just are programmed to think like robots and think the same ways, right? But there has to be a unity in our thinking in terms of what our interests are and how we go about fighting to gain our interests. Who else? Oh, we people getting loose in the responses now. Okay. Sometimes we can be our own obstacle towards progress. We need to recognize who we are individually and as a group before we can tackle our common enemy. We cannot move forward divided. Okay. Brother Khalil, as Nkrumah has said, we must progress and move forward while retaining and recreating society based on our traditional African traditions, which is naturally socialist and anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist. Woo! Yes, indeed. Real quick. Y'all getting me loose with these answers. So to highlight Brother Khalil's response in terms of recreating a society based on our traditions and principles. When we think about the current society that we're living in, I want us to frame it as an inherently anti-African reality. And what that means is, not only do we live in a place where we are hated and not wanted, but the very reality in which we exist is rooted in our exploitation, and it depends on our oppression. So when we think of capitalism, colonialism, imperialism, these are all things that are inherently anti-us. So if we exist in a time and place where those very things are the fabrics of the society, that entire society is anti-us. So there's no reforming that society. There's no working from within and changing that society. There is only the destruction and the elimination of that society. And as Brother Khalil articulates, the recreating of a society based on our natural and, traditional approaches to life, for sure. What else? Getting to our roots, knowing ourselves, power, unity in order to free ourselves from the unjust reign, okay? Sister Micah, what's the deal? At the end of the day, our enemy has many faces that impacts all of us across the world. We can only move forward if we move together, okay? Yes, indeed. We shouldn't punch down on members of the community. Just because they may not conform to social norms that derive from the current capitalist structure and societies that we live in. We must uplift each other in dignified ways to progress. Very good. Yes, indeed. Hold each other accountable for liberation and maintain consistency upon the principles that are rooted. We should always remember checking with ourselves. Yes, indeed. So again, if we frame this society and if we frame the reality we exist in currently as a reality that is anti-us as a people, that is anti-African, it is much easier, or we operate with a much clearer perspective on the world and what needs to change, right? It's like this. If let's say you have a car and you drive your car and you use your car, and naturally over time there's some wear and tear. So you take it to get it fixed, whatever, repairs. Then after so much time and so much use and so much wear and tear, you try to take your car in to get it fixed. The mechanic says, sorry, your car is beyond repair. Do we think in our minds, would it be a logical thing to say, no, try to fix it? No, the car is beyond repair. There's no fixing it. You need a new car. We should frame our reality and our society as that car beyond repair. There is no, just, throw some new tires on it. Oh, just get a new paint job on the car. No, the car is beyond repair. This reality that we exist in is beyond reform. It is beyond change. right? What is required is total transformation, total destruction of the society and the recreation of the society. We need a new car, essentially. So that concludes our lesson for this evening, the Origins of Pan-Africanism. Again, this entire presentation is available on the PE with ABC syllabus, which you all should have received via email. So you have access to it. So it's there for you to look through again and again. And you can visit our social media here. Yes, we have a question. Sister Jamila, do you want to put it in the chat box and I can answer it? And please, at this time, if anyone has any questions or anything, please just write them in the chat and then I'll answer them for sure. What are some ways you can tap in on a continental basis? What news sites or social media pages do you follow that help you stay connected globally on recent issues? Great question. So when it comes to maintaining a global orientation to studying our people and gaining information on our people, really there first has to be the conscious and the consistent intention to study our people globally. So when we think about our efforts, they should really exist like this. So we struggle local. We struggle local and we study global. And what that means is we're only one person. We can only, exist in one place at one time. So it isn't realistic for us to be, to try to be everywhere at the same time. So we struggle where we are. We struggle locally, but we study globally, right? We are intentional about, and really, in this day and age, the resources and technology we have at our disposal is such a valuable asset that our ancestors, even a generation ago, did not have, right? So we have to take full advantage of it. So that's like the abstract answer. The tangible answer is it's important to cross-reference news sites and information. So it isn't beneficial to just get your information from one website or from one source. So if anyone and everyone has information on resources, please throw them in the group chat as you all have started doing, because it's important for us to know. And then really, I would just say stay tapped in with individuals who are studying global, brothers like Khalil, and folks like that who are very active on social media, and things like that. And then this is what I'll do, just to ensure we don't miss any resources or anything like that. Any information on news sites or databases and things like that, if you can send me those in an email at communityprograms@ablackcoalition.org, if you just send those to me, I'll be able to create a basic document listing all those resources, and I'll share that with you all, everyone who's a registered participant in the program. So again, for all the resources, websites, databases, books, articles, anything and everything related to our people, just send that to me. I'll put it here. Email that to me, and then I can share it with the group at large. communityprograms@ablackcoalition.org. So again, if anyone has any further questions or things they want to share, resources, things like that, please do so now. Follow ABC on Instagram and on Twitter. Again, when we do this work, this is very fundamental and it's very surface level. And that's not a bad thing. We just have to understand that, there's always going to be deeper research for us to do, and it's up to us to do it, right? So if there are no further questions or anything like that, I will say peace and Black power to you all. My name is Makonnen Tendaji. I am the SoCal Black Community Programs Director for the African Black Coalition. This was lesson number 2 with PE with ABC. We appreciate you all for tuning in and tapping in, and we hope that you do further research, once this is over. And everyone stay safe and stay healthy. And yeah, peace.